the reason why bipolar has become chronic is because of the treatment itself. So if you change the treatment approach, if you utilize integrated research and science-based treatment model, you can actually heal the things that are causing the symptoms to occur and heal your bipolar disorder. This is the final podcast episode for 2023. It has been an amazing year, and I want to thank you for being a loyal subscriber to the podcast. This has been a year of growth, and it's been amazing. We've had some incredible guests this year. And this final episode is going to be wonderful because it's my final episode, but it's also my last solo episode of the year. And it's a really important one because in order to heal your bipolar, there needs to be a mindset shift. One of the things that I've discovered as I've talked to different people over the past 3 years since I've started my blog and especially this year after starting my podcast is that a lot of people don't realize you can heal because of the beliefs we hold about what bipolar disorder is in the first place. And I want to talk about that first because understanding what bipolar is critical in order to understand that you can actually heal. So the three myths that are amazing to me that they're still perpetuated in our society are, number one, that bipolar disorder is a chemical imbalance. And I believe that for a couple decades, actually. When I was diagnosed back in 1998, that was what my doctor told me when I was first diagnosed. I was told that I had a chemical imbalance and that medication was used to help balance out my brain chemistry. And I actually had several other doctors after that tell me. And so I was shocked when I read Anatomy of an Epidemic and discovered that theory of bipolar had been completely debunked even before I was diagnosed. It was proven false. There is no underlying chemical imbalance that has been detected that causes bipolar disorder. In fact, as I've mentioned before, and as I've written about on my blog, not only is there no chemical imbalance that causes bipolar symptoms in the first place, but the medications that are being used actually cause chemical imbalances in the brain. When I read Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, and if you haven't heard the podcast episode with him, I'll make sure I link that in the show notes. He talked about how in the 1990s, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health wrote a paper about how medications actually work. And he said that they work by perturbing normal brain functions. Medications, psychotropic medications themselves cause a chemical imbalance in the brain. They don't fix it, they cause it. So that is the first myth, is that bipolar disorder is not a chemical imbalance. That has been completely debunked for over 30 years. The second myth is that that bipolar is like diabetes and that medication is like insulin. And this is another one that is completely false. There was actually never any evidence to support this claim in the first place. Diabetes, even though we don't entirely understand what causes a person's body to develop diabetes in the first place, there's a lot of things that have been discovered, and there's a lot of research that's being done now that shows genetic links and that kind of thing. But we do know what are causing the symptoms to occur. When somebody is displaying the symptoms of diabetes, their blood can be tested and it can be clearly identified that their body is not able to regulate its own blood sugar. And they are able to use a standardized protocol to treat that. They know that the body isn't able to regulate its blood sugar, and they can use insulin and food to then manually regulate your blood sugar. That is not the case for bipolar disorder. As I mentioned before, if you go on the National Institute for Mental Health's website right now and you type in what causes bipolar disorder, it will say we don't know what causes bipolar. And the reason is that we're looking at a group of symptoms. What they've done is they've created a diagnosis solely based on symptoms without identifying the underlying cause of the symptoms. And then they treat the symptoms with medication that cause a chemical imbalance. So no, bipolar is not like diabetes and medication is not like insulin. That is a myth. That is not factually correct. The third myth is that bipolar is chronic and incurable. And this is the saddest one of all, I think, because we have been told that it is chronic and incurable. And the treatment itself is what causes it to become chronic and incurable. Way back before they had medication, it was very rare for people to be diagnosed with, they didn't have the bipolar diagnosis actually at that time, but for somebody to be diagnosed with what we would now call bipolar disorder, it was very rare for that diagnosis to occur. And it was even more rare for it to become a chronic problem. People who displayed manic or depressive symptoms or manic depressive symptoms would recover. Most of the time, they would recover and live normal lives. It was very rare for it to become a chronic problem. It was only when psychotropic medications were introduced as the standard protocol for treating somebody who came presented with bipolar symptoms that it became a chronic and incurable problem. It is the treatment itself that is causing it to be chronic and incurable because, number one, you are not addressing the underlying cause of the symptoms. And number two, you are treating the symptoms with psychotropic medications that have been proven to cause chemical imbalances in the brain. They are not normalizing the brain's function. They are abnormalizing it. So if these three things are true, that they are myths, if these three things are myths, so if bipolar is not a chemical imbalance, if bipolar is not like a diabetes and the medication is not like insulin, and if it's not true that bipolar is incurable and chronic, then what is true about bipolar disorder? So the truth about bipolar is that we have created a diagnosis based solely on symptoms. And it was for the purpose of medicating people. That was why the diagnosis was created. I believe it was created back in the early 1980s. It was standardized in the DSM manual, the diagnostics manual for diagnosing mental health issues. And it was created for the sole purpose of prescribing medication. That's why that diagnosis was created. The problem is over the years, when people would present with symptoms that didn't fall into the category, then they just broadened the category. And this, if you're curious about the history of this, I would encourage you to read Anatomy of an Epidemic. That was so eye-opening for me. So many things that I had suspected were confirmed as I read this book, and it is extraordinarily well documented. And again, I will link the podcast episode in which I interviewed Robert Whitaker, who's the author of this book. But bipolar disorder, I feel like it's almost poorly named in the first place. It's not necessarily a disorder. What we have are people who are presenting with symptoms, serious symptoms, that indicate that the mind is in distress. And the three most common causes for these symptoms are, number one, people who have micronutrient deficiencies. And this was so eye-opening for me. I started on the micronutrient treatment just because I was desperate. I had been trying medication for over 12 years at that point, and I was just suffering. Nothing was working. I had tried all kinds of medications. At one point, I was on 7 different medications, and nothing was working. I was suffering. I was sick. I had been hospitalized a number of times, and I was desperate. And a friend of mine had told me about this micronutrient treatment, this specialized micronutrient treatment from a company, a nonprofit out of Canada called Truehope. And my doctor and I looked at the research that had been done on this treatment. There were 35 clinical trials that have been, studies that have been done on it by independent doctors and universities across the US and Canada, not affiliated with the company. They were just doing research. That was one of those doctors, or two of the doctors that did the research were Doctors Bonnie Kaplan and Doctors Julia Reckledge. And I interviewed Dr. Kaplan on my podcast. That one's episode 13, and I'll link that in the show notes. But they found that the occurrence of micronutrient deficiencies correlates with the onset of these disorders, these mental health issues, these mental illnesses. And it was fascinating. One of the things that was in the book that was so fascinating is we talk a lot of times about, or we hear a lot of times about how bipolar often is genetic. And the interesting thing is that they actually found that there is a genetic component to micronutrient deficiency. As they did their research, they discovered a lot of times in families where people were presenting with the symptoms of bipolar, there was a family history of people presenting with symptoms of bipolar. And what they discovered was that there are certain people whose bodies are genetically predisposed to need higher levels of micronutrients in order to function in a healthy way. Our brains require an extraordinarily high amount of vitamins and minerals, micronutrients, in order to function, much more than the rest of our body does. The brains require a much higher level. And if they don't get what they need, then the neural receptor, I'm forgetting what the name of it is, but our brains don't function in a healthy way. And our soil has become so much more depleted that even if you're on a whole foods diet, if you are one of those people like me who is genetically predisposed to needing more micronutrients than average, you're going to suffer. Your brain is going to suffer. And the symptoms that it displays are mental illness symptoms. So depression, anxiety, even mania. So that's one of the main causes of symptoms of not just bipolar disorder, but also ADHD and depression and anxiety. A lot of these mental health symptoms are coming as a direct result of people suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. The second one is trauma. And I've talked about this before. I actually, on a couple episodes back, I had an amazing doctor on, or a therapist on, who talked about how trauma can cause severe emotional dysregulation. It can put us into an almost constant state of fight or flight. And it dysregulates our emotional responses to things and can cause symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of mania even. And so untreated trauma can lead to the symptoms that will later be diagnosed as bipolar. And in The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk talks about how we are missing the boat completely when it comes to people who are struggling with untreated trauma or unhealed trauma. They are going into doctors, into psychiatrists, because they are having these symptoms, and they're getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They're getting diagnosed with depression. They're getting diagnosed with anxiety, even PTSD, and given medication. And they're told, let us fix you. We're going to fix you. We're going to give you a pill and that's going to fix you. But it's not addressing the underlying cause of the symptoms. And as I mentioned before, these psychotropic medications can cause chemical imbalances in their brain. So not only are you not treating the underlying cause of the problem, but you're dysregulating the mind and making it harder for the brain to function in a healthy way. And the third is, ironically, antidepressants. It was so eye-opening to me because this is one of the problems I had. I actually had two of these factors before I was diagnosed. But antidepressants, up to 40% of the people taking antidepressants will later display symptoms of bipolar disorder. And when that happened to me, I was told, oh, we misdiagnosed you. You don't have depression, you have bipolar disorder. It's super common. And I started out with a bipolar 2 diagnosis, and I ended up with a bipolar 1 diagnosis later when I had a psychotic episode. And so we are treating people with antidepressants and then triggering mania. And one of the incredible things is that the research shows that the psychiatric drug industry knows that antidepressants can trigger manic symptoms in people. But they don't acknowledge that the drugs themselves are causing the symptoms. They just tell you need more drugs. So we have been misled as far as what is actually causing our symptoms to occur. And once you understand what might be causing your symptoms, you can start treating the symptoms of bipolar, not a disorder, but the underlying causes of the symptoms, and actually begin to heal. That's the incredible thing, is that the reason why bipolar has become chronic is because of the treatment itself. So if you change the treatment approach, if you utilize integrated research and science-based treatment model, you can actually heal the things that are causing the symptoms to occur and heal your bipolar disorder.